Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Down South Salvation Podcast. For this week's episode, we have Dr. Curtin here from the Scriptorium Project. So he's going to tell us a little bit about his faith journey and his and the Scriptorium Project. But before we do that, I'm going to open us in prayer. Almighty Father, whose blessed Son, before his passion, prayed for his disciples that they might be one, as you and he are one, grant that your church, being bound together in love and obedience to you, may be united in one body by the one Spirit, that the world may believe in him who you have sent, your Son Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. All right, Dr. Curtin, so why don't you kind of go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the Scriptorium Project.
Sure. So, my first name is technically Dermot, but I find that most Americans get confused by that. So, scholarly, I usually write under the name D.P. Curtin. My project, the Scriptorium Project, has been in operation for quite a few years now. We maintain this very large catalog of works relating to the early church, particularly during the Dark Ages and the medieval era. And at this point, we have several hundred items in our collection in terms of being publicly available, translated usually from the Latin into English, so that they can be understood by the general public. These are usually texts that have not been publicly distributed, in some cases ever. So trying to be able to give people a sense of what was happening in this time period, and sometimes it's very regional. So there's things happening in the African church or Punic church, in France, in Germany, Ireland, England, Greece, into Syria and Egypt, all the way as far as India. Being able to give that accessibility to everyone that's just kind of at your fingertips now. Where in the past, if you really wanted to know about what was going on at a place or a time, there was always a third party. You read about it in a textbook, and at least in my experiences, those readings about what was going on are usually shockingly superficial and a lot of times just incredibly inaccurate. So this is an effort for anyone to be able to read the primary sources, to be able to go back to what was being said and who was saying it.
Wow, that's actually very fascinating. So I'm curious, what kind of challenges do you typically run into in doing this kind of work?
So the most immediate challenge is being able to find the texts, which for most people, if you want to find a book, it's straightforward, right? You go to your local library, you go to Amazon, and it's just right there. But a lot of the things that we're looking for are very much in an archival state. So, if I want to know what was happening in, let's say, the Dark Age church in England, that those records do exist, you can't go to your local library. There is no Amazon dealer who kind of works with that. What I'm doing is being able to find these manuscripts, transcribing and translating them, which sounds like it would be straightforward, but being able to find texts, particularly specific texts, is very challenging. So you kind of have to be able to dig through sometimes very archaic books, which are no longer even in circulation, being able to create a facsimile for some of them, and transcribing them into like a modern Word document so that any kind of work can begin. And sometimes the introductions of those facsimiles are very interesting. There's a few of them where I picked up where they have a royal sponsor and they thank, His Majesty James the First for his wonderful contributions. That gives you a good sense of how infrequently a lot of these texts have been in circulation. And usually when it's an old book and it's a language that's unintelligible to people, there's not even any effort.
Yeah, I could imagine that. I'm just thinking of someone. Oh gosh, I'm just thinking of some regular person nowadays trying to read Latin. Oh goodness, like an entire
Yeah.
book in Latin. Oh man, I bet that's. Ugh, makes
For
me.
most people, It's an overwhelming task. Now, at one time, even in the United States, to go to college, it was expected that you would have some level of fluency in Latin and Greek. So we have all these books that are floating out there now that effectively most people can't read, which is this trove of information that's just been kind of lost because of the atrophy of our educational system.
Yeah, I know about as much Latin as you typically learn when you deal with the legal system. Because I was in law enforcement, and then I got a paralegal degree, so I picked up on just enough Latin to understand some of the Latin terms they still use in those fields of
Yeah.
work. But like, there's no way I could never. I've always thought it would be kind of funny to learn Latin and just have my really thick Southern accent over top the Latin and just be conversationally speaking Latin. You know.
So at another time, it was considered very in vogue, even in the American South, that Latin was very big, especially classical Latin. We have at least one U.S. president that was a Hannibal. I forget, it was Lincoln or Johnson's vice president. But the idea that, like, our interest in classical antiquity, the idea of our republic goes back to its Latin roots. And how do we understand the pitfalls of that republic if we didn't read what they were doing?
Right, exactly. No, I agree completely. It's so strange for people to be like, "Oh, America has nothing to do with Rome." Like that's not true.
Yeah.
That's not true. We may not be Rome, but we're definitely modeled very much so off of
Yeah.
Rome.
So, especially within our legal system, most American law is built off what they call the Corpus Juris Civilis, which was put together by the Emperor Justinian around the year 550, which is supposed to be a simplification of Roman law. So, even in relatively simple encounters that you have, like Miranda rights, so you get arrested, you have the right to remain silent. Everything that you do or say could be held against you in a court of law. That goes directly to its early Roman origins with Poetas et constantiri videnter. Silence infers agreement.
Hmm.
Now, kind of being able to have that carry over, there's a direct line between Roman law and the system of government and the system of law that we've developed here in the States.
Right, and of course that would have been transmitted to us through the English common law for the most part. And I guess in Louisiana, whatever the French were doing.
Well, yeah, so French law's a little bit different with that. But yeah, American law has the English common law tradition, which is usually case law.
Right.
Most maximum laws come from its Latin origin. But the fusion of those two together make up most of our understanding of constitutional law.
Right. So what got you started in all of this? I mean, like personally, like what was your journey to end up here?
So initially, this had started as an undergrad. Um, I was a theology student at Villanova and trying to be able to get my hands on some books that were interesting to me that existed, but nobody knew where they were. They were in a language that was unintelligible to pretty much all members of the faculty at that point.
Hmm.
So there was a sense of kind of mystery that was associated with this. I could read about things happening in the early church. I mean, people can tell me that and their own summary of it, but there's something missing there. So there's writers like St. Albert the Great, also known as Albertus Magnus. He's writing in the 13th century. He says a lot of things that would be very interesting to us in terms of the development of the Western Church, but he's also interested in strange things to us, like his use of astrology in Christianity, which ordinarily is considered heterodox. So, what was his argument? I mean, I can get like a sentence out of the encyclopedia that talks about Albertus Magnus, but to read him directly, that's something different. It's you're drawn into their world and you can have a conversation with them, or at least hear what it is that they're trying to convey over the course of 8 centuries.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. You're right. So where I mean, like, where are you? I'm assuming you're finding these manuscripts mostly in church archives or university archives. Or museum archives. I'm assuming.
They are kind of from sundry sources. So, we put out a number of synods from the medieval Irish Church, which we were able to get from the archival work of the Church of Ireland, which is an Anglican body. They've been able to maintain it, but they also haven't published it in several centuries, and the editions that they have, again, are all in Latin. So useful to maintain, but it's not accessible to people. If people really want to know, and Ireland is a very tight place, the history of their parish, the history of their diocese, it's mysterious. And it doesn't have to be. So being able to get those things out there was certainly very welcome. Other ones, like the famous Synod of Whitby in 664, which was supposed to be able to resolve disputes over the date of Easter and bring the alleged Celtic Church closer to Canterbury and to Rome. That's something that I'd heard about since childhood, but nobody had an original copy of it. It was just kind of like assumed, like, okay, this is what happened. But again, we're back to the position of what was actually said.
Right.
That is, along with the Irish synods, is also out in plain English publication.
Okay. I might have to look into that later. Because I always, of course, being on the internet so much, you always hear all these conspiracy theories about, oh, Easter's pagan. Oh, there's no basis for Easter. Like,
Yeah, those make the rounds this time of year, and they're always exhausting. So the alleged pagan deity Auster, we only know one line about her, and it comes from St. Bede, the Venerable, and it says that he thinks there was a deity down in Kent, in southern England, and she was worshipped during what he calls Easter Monat, which is to say the month of April. But like, we have no other information beyond that, and he could be wrong because he's recalling this as a folk memory several centuries after her cult had died out.
right. So we don't actually know what even that looked like realistically. We just don't know, and we probably never will.
So in the course of historiography, when we see things corroborated, so if Bede said it and then we had a couple of other people talking about it, we could say more firmly, like, yes, this was a thing. But we have a throwaway line, a single fragment of a sentence as the pinnacle of our information. Everything else about Auster or Esther is effectively 19th century mythology, just kind of reinvented. There's nothing about eggs or about bunnies or about some connection to the long dead Sumerian goddess Ishtar. That's not any relationship whatsoever. But going back to the source there, so what do we know about things that have happened in the past? If we didn't have Bede and we couldn't point to that source, it would be very mysterious to us.
Right. We may not even know that was even an ancient pagan deity to begin with. We may just have assumed. I don't even know what we would have assumed. It would just be a void in history, like a lot of things are. Yeah.
And paganism survives in our language in all kinds of ways. It doesn't mean that our language is pagan.
Exactly.
Words like panic, relating to the god Pan, hermetically sealed by Hermes, venereal diseases of Venus. We're not making some kind of homage to pagan gods here. This is just the tradition that's kind of handed down. Or any day of the week, for that matter, which have to do with Woden or Odin or Thor or Fries, all Germanic pagan deities.
Exactly. So walk me through some of the process for, like, let's say you find a manuscript you want to translate. Walk me through step one all the way to getting it out to the public.
So the first one is the painful task of research and acquisition. So I'll give you the hypothetical because it's something that we're working on right now. I would like to be able to find the ancient letters of Ireland's ancient high kings. They ruled the island for 3,000 years, and in that time so far, I found exactly 2 letters, which might make up a single page. So not something that's publishable. So let's say we're able to research, we find the source of a document, we're able to kind of compile it, find another document, and bring all of these together to form a single corpus of the text. Sometimes somebody's published facsimiles of those in the past, so they've typed it up in Latin text, and it's simple to transliterate. Other times you have to go to the Latin manuscripts, which is very challenging because the way that Latin is written out in our mind is very different from the way that medieval Latin appears in things like manuscript forms, where letters, and even in early publications. So I mentioned this one book, I think by James Ussher, the Anglican Archbishop of Armagh. He is printing in the 17th century. And if you've ever read books from that period, they use things like publishers' S's, which always look like F's, which get very confused. I don't believe that they have a distinction between two V's and W at that time period. So you'll get very strange looking words. So trying to transcribe it's always a challenge. Assuming that we're able to get past that. We have the text, we found it, we're able to put it into Word. Now there's the task of translating it itself, which again, sounds like it should be straightforward. But even with Latin texts, even with Latin being a dead language, there's different types of Latin. So both by region, they're going to use words that are specific to their time period and place. There's also classical Latin, let's say the Latin that's used during the height of the empire, and vulgar Latin that's used during the Dark Ages and into the Middle Ages. And sometimes you see the influx of specific words, and those serve as a bridge to more familiar things like Spanish and French and Italian. So it requires a little bit of caution in working with some of those particularly early texts. There are some texts that are just really challenging because you can see the monk who composed it, their intention was good, but they were a terrible grammarian. So like the Latin words are there, they don't make any sense. It's particularly bad. A work of the unfortunately named Visigothic king Sisebut, who he tried to write some piece of hagiography, and he wanted to be poetic, but he did not understand the laws that kind of dictate Latin grammar, the mechanics that are associated with it. So you have all these sentence fragments. So on the translator part, it becomes a question of the philosophy of translation. Are you going to translate it specifically and detail verbatim of exactly what was said? In which case, no one would read it because no one would know what was going on. You have to be able to offer some level of interpolation of the text, of being to suggest, like, I think this is what he means. I think this is what he's talking about. And in doing so, you are changing the text, which isn't great, but otherwise it would be a meaningless document, which would have no value to the public at all. After it's translated, it has to go to editing to make sure that it's workable, and then formatting so that it fits a modern book format, which you can find on pretty much any shelf. Right. And then into distribution. And I think at this point, we're in something like 40,000 distributors, so you should be able to find the books anywhere.
I got you. So now I'm assuming. So obviously you're the one who started the whole thing, obviously, mm-hmm. But I'm assuming it's not just you running the whole thing at this point. I'm assuming there's.
Yeah. So I can handle the Latin world fairly well. It's just that when you cross into the Eastern Church, Latin is non-existent. Nobody's using Latin.
Right.
So that becomes a bit of an issue. Now, I have training with ancient Greek and Athanase and Koine in particular, which is semi-useful. But when you're going into things like Coptic documents, this is a language that technically has been dead for 5 centuries. So who's going to help you to be able to take that? Or in the Slavic world, because there's lots of documents that involve the church as it came into the Ukraine, into Georgia, into Russia, into the South Slavic peoples like the Bulgars coming into the area. I don't know those languages. So in that role, I have to step into that of an editor and use contractors to be able to help be able to fill in the gap there.
Right.
So
now, have y'all, speaking on Ukraine and Russia, have y'all run into more issues lately, given the geopolitical conflict currently occurring over there?
like specific to publishing or
Like
ecclesiastics?
specific to like obtaining documents to even translate.
Hmm. So the East is really challenging. With Latin and even with Greek, I can pick it up. Latin is quick. Greek usually takes me a little while to see exactly what it is I'm reading. I have no basis of knowledge when it comes to the Cyrillic alphabet.
Right.
It's it's supposed to be based on Hebrew and Greek itself, but it's very unique in its phonological structure.
Hmm.
So I'm pretty helpless when it comes to being able to go over those initial documents. Uh, Trying to get access to it. One of the things that goes on with the Latin West is we have repository of records.
Right.
So I mentioned the Archbishop of Armagh, Canterbury, the Vatican Archives, the University of Paris, the Sorbonne Library, all of which have made an effort to collect those documents into a single place for easy access for either historians or seminarians or whatever the case may be. The East had that at one time in places like the University of Constantinople, but the fracturing of that has made their documents dispersed everywhere. Uh, and the variety of languages that they're in also doesn't help. So if you go to places like the monastic community at Mount Athos, they have lots of libraries, but you need to know Bulgarian and Serbian and medieval Greek and Romanian, and that is a big ask for any scholar. And sometimes there are archaic versions of those languages too.
I gotcha. Yeesh. That does sound. That actually does sound very, very challenging. So now I'm curious: is there a particular manuscript or set of manuscripts that hold like a real special significance to you that you've been able to translate so far?
So, we're talking about like personal or academically.
Either.
Hmm. So, we were able to put out some books of the Ethiopian Bible, which are unusual. So, if you go into Orthodox or Catholic Bibles in the Deuterocanon, you'll have
Mm-hmm.
the familiar Book of Maccabees.
Right.
In the Protestant worlds, they'll usually talk about it them being distinctive, separate apocryphal documents, but they're familiar. In the West, there's two books of Maccabees. In the East, there's four, but they've been reviewed by scholars fairly well. Ethiopia has its own Bible with its own content, and their Book of Maccabees is unknown. There's three of them, and they're not related to any of the books that we find in either East or West.
Oh.
In fact, so in working with them, I don't know what they are at all. They appear to be a collection of sermons that have been pieced together over a story which could be of very ancient origin. Um, and by very ancient, I mean going back possibly to the 4th century. Um, there is effectively no scholarship on the subject because nobody's touched them because they've been so strange. But they do give us some insight into what was happening in Ethiopia and its contact with the Western Church centuries later.
Huh.
That they're sometimes they're called the Maccabean, the Amharic word for Maccabees, or Ethiopian Maccabees because they're distinctive.
Huh. Wow. I didn't realize that. I mean, I knew the Ethiopian Bible had more books than even the Eastern Orthodox or Catholic Bibles. Or I guess technically speaking, my RSV and NRSV sitting on my shelf back there.
Yeah. So these are books that you won't find in any compilation of biblical literature because they've only been recently translated by the Scriptorium Project itself.
Wow.
Um, there are other books that are out there in the Ethiopian Bible, like the Book of Josephon,
Uh huh.
which is probably a medieval work. Um, and things like Jubilees and First Enoch, which are more familiar. They were rediscovered by Scottish scholars in the 18th century. But at the time prior to that, they were just assumed to be unknown, something the early church used, but was forgotten otherwise.
Right. I got you. Yeah, I've heard enough about Enoch for sure. Oh my gosh. Every like Every like conspiracy theorist is always quoting from Enoch for some reason, and it's really weird.
Yeah, it's a very strange book in the apocryphal canon, but we're talking about something that's probably composed within the second century BC.
Right.
Um, the other later works in Enoch are, I believe, to be Christian compositions sometime after the birth of Christ, like the third century.
Hmm.
Um, I tend to avoid the kind of apocalyptic literature because it's hard to really be able to do much with it.
Right. Naturally. So are there any like technical advancements in your field that you've been really looking forward to that are really going to help you? Like for instance, like say AI, do you think that's going to have an impact on what you do or
Yes and no. So originally in transcribing documents, you had to do it by hand, where you write and you type.
right.
AI has been really helpful in terms of transcription for most most facsimiles. So like it can scan a document as long as it's in like a modern, understandable script and be able to instantly pick up on it. When you're dealing with medieval texts or with really anything published before 1800, it's not going to work. So the AI is very useful at recognizing modern typographic script, but anything outside of that, you still have to do it the old-fashioned way.
I got you. Are there any plans to maybe build your own AI model and train it on ancient scripts?
That would be great. I mean, the way that it works right now with modern facsimiles definitely speeds up the process. I don't know if we have the money to be able to design something specific for that. It's the medieval script that's the really challenging one because it's the specific hand of the writer. This is very stylized, so you kind of have to get a sense of exactly what letters they're trying to form by seeing
Right.
other letters. It's like Champollion's deciphering of the Rosetta Stone in the 19th century.
Right. I got you. So it's very okay. So pretty much every letter is going to be unique between the different authors, even if they're writing the same language from the same region at the same time period. It's probably going to look slightly different. Okay.
Yeah, and even things like punctuation, which we take for granted now, was not set in stone. Or what's worse is standardized spelling,
Oh,
which, again, these are all modern ideas that help us to be able to move relatively quickly with texts. But there's no agency that can really enforce things like punctuation in the Dark Ages.
I got you. Yeah, I guess that's true. I guess that is very true. So, what what upcoming I don't want to call them projects, but what upcoming releases and whatnot are you looking forward to giving to the public, so to speak?
Um, so I am trying to kind of dig into what's otherwise unknown to people in the church, at least in the United States, um, especially in the circles that I run. In my high school, everyone was Irish or Polish or Italian. So the Irish thing weighs very heavily, especially on me personally. But there isn't a lot out there. And some of that has to do with the turbulent history of Ireland. The texts are lost or destroyed or just kind of sit on an archive shelf and collapse into themselves. So I want to know more about the Irish church and the Irish state prior to 1171 when the Normans had showed up and firmly established themselves on the island. So I mentioned letters of the High Kings. We have some papal documents, some things into the Dark Ages, uh, what they call pseudepigrapha documents, meaning that they say they're composed by Saint Patrick. They're not composed by Saint Patrick. We know that they're not. The way that they write is very distinctive for Insular Latin a few centuries later. Being able to find texts and sometimes add this kind of like precautionary introductory line to say, this is a fascinating document, but it's not true. Um, some of which relate to Patrick, becomes this very almost mythological figure in the High Middle Ages. Um, Sometimes with the cults of saints, in general, if they're composed close to the saint's lifetime, then they're a reasonable source of history. But the more time that goes on, especially leaving the Dark Ages, the Seculae Obscura, then you start to see all these kind of like shaggy dog stories developing, and it becomes a little bit of a challenge. But for my part, the focus is on Ireland, on Scotland, and on England right now. So even in Anglican circles, talking about those pivotal early saints. So who was Saint Dunstan? What were the things that were being said about him? Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's this massive intellectual force within the medieval church. People know the name. They don't know much about him beyond that, though. But a lot of his reforms are still with us, both within Anglicanism and the Catholic Church in the United Kingdom.
Right. I got you. Well, what advice, what tips would you have for anyone who might be interested in this line of work that you do?
I guess my first question is, who else is interested in this kind of work?
I'm sure there's some undergrad student or someone out there.
So admittedly, this is a niche marketplace. So when I was in school, and when I was in high school, I was originally sold on the idea of Latin because it was good for the SATs. And that was kind of the short-term myopic approach to things. That like, okay, it'll push up your score a little bit more. But the application kind of far exceeds that. So in sitting through things like medical didactics while in residency, I was able to kind of reverse engineer exactly what was taking place based upon knowledge of Latin. So even though it's a dead language, even though it's conversationally and literally kind of like divorced from where we're at right now, it still has a lot of application if you're trying to be able to understand things like law and like medicine, which form the foundation of places like the University of Paris in the medieval era. There were three majors. You were either in theology, law, or medicine. And sometimes they kind of blurred those ones together too. But recognize that those are the foundations for science, and the scientific language that we still use is Latin, gives it a lot of application still. Anyone who's really interested in languages or, historic preservation of documents, I would start with trying to be able to develop our understanding of grammar, both in Romance languages and also Germanic languages, which would make things a little bit more comprehensible. That is an intensive process, but the more that you're able to kind of lay down the groundwork and understanding things, and especially in terms of lexicon, the easier it'll be in the future.
All right. Well, I guess my last question for you is, where can people find your work?
So, as a review of what the collection looks like, they can go to www.thescriptoriumproject.com, where we have all of the works currently on display. The easier places to be able to find them in terms of purchase, you can get them on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Google, iTunes, you pretty much name it.
Pretty much anywhere that sells books.
What's that?
I said pretty much anywhere that sells books.
Yeah, at this point, we're everywhere. I think it's something like 80 countries that are selling it at this point. So anywhere that sells English language books, although the United States is still very much the top marketplace.
Right, I got you. All right, well, that was all my questions for you. Do you have any questions for me?
I don't think so, no.
All right, awesome. Well, folks, thanks for joining us, and it's been great. It's been great to have you on, Dr. Curtin, and hopefully I'll have you on again at some point.
Yeah, sounds great.
With that said, I'm going to go ahead and close this out in prayer. Ever-living God, whose will it is that all should come to you through your Son, Jesus Christ, inspire our witness to him that all may know the power of his forgiveness and the hope of his resurrection, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of the Down South Salvation Podcast. I hope you found our discussion insightful and engaging. If you enjoyed the show, please consider liking this episode and sharing it with your friends and family. It really helps me reach more listeners like you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode. You can also follow me on X, formerly Twitter, at Methodist Anglo, and Instagram at Down South Salvation for updates and more. For additional content and to stay updated, find me on YouTube, Substack, and all major podcast platforms at the Down South Salvation Podcast. Your support means the world to me, and I look forward to bringing you more exciting episodes soon. Until next time, stay blessed.